listening to The Critical Hour on Radio Sputnik. I'm your host, Garland Nixon, with my co-host, Dr. Wilmer Leon.
Thank you, Garland.
The president of Nigeria has stated that weapons from the Ukraine conflict are showing up in the hands of terrorists in the Lake Chad region of Africa, presumably purchased on the black market. Joining us to discuss this and other stories, we have Dr. Gerald Horne. He's a professor of history at the University of Houston in Texas. He's an author, a historian, and a researcher. Dr. Horne, welcome back to The Critical Hour.
Thank you for inviting me.
Well, there's some chickens, unfortunately, coming home to roost, but they're roosting in Africa. Antiwar.com says Nigerian president says weapons from Ukraine are winding up in Africa. Muhammadu Buhari says the weapons are, quote, bolstering the ranks of terrorists. Your thoughts, Dr. Horne?
Well, this should only come as a shock and surprise to those who are not paying attention. We have known from the inception of the conflict between Ukraine and Russia in February 2022 that NATO and the North Atlantic powers led by the United States intended to create a kind of Afghanistan in the heart of Europe. Recall that when Washington began its more overt and conspicuous intervention in Afghanistan, a central purpose was to weaken Moscow, the then Soviet Union. But by pouring weapons into Afghanistan, it had knock-on and deleterious effects, not least in neighboring Pakistan. And even though the Soviet Union collapsed and before that had withdrawn from Afghanistan, and then the United States got involved post-September 2001 against the Taliban, the fact of the matter is that even after Washington was driven out in the early stages of the Biden administration, Pakistan continues to suffer grievously from that ill-fated, ill-considered U.S. military intervention. I would also say, with regard to that article quoting the Nigerian president, that weapons from Ukraine are not only leaking into the Lake Chad region of Africa, they're also spreading throughout the continent of Europe as well. We have credible reports from Helsinki to that effect. And this obviously is part of the disaster that has been created in the heart of Europe. And I think that's one of the reasons we have to take seriously the recent remarks by President Macron that there needs to be negotiations to bring a halt to this conflict, not to mention the fact that that comment by President Macron was followed swiftly by a phone call from Chancellor Scholz of Berlin to Moscow. The only spanner in the works, as they say in London, is the fact that it does not appear that Washington, the neocons, are interested in negotiation because from their point of view, this intervention is, quote, working, unquote. Certainly it's leading to the devastation of Ukraine, but from their point of view, it's tying down Moscow, and it's also hampering relations between the European Union and Russia. It has the potential to hamper relations between the European Union and China. And so, therefore, Washington, as of today, has little interest in seeing this conflict come to a close.
So Buhari's comments come as Republicans continue to call for more oversight over the $19 billion in weapons. But you've got Democrats like Adam Smith not only pushing back against oversight, but using the often used trope that this is nothing more than Russian propaganda. So two things. One, the Democrats are the hawks here, where we know stereotypically they are considered to be the peaceniks. So this also makes me wonder, are the weapons, quote unquote, leaking in through the black market, or were they being intentionally diverted to that region in the first place?
Well, that's a very good question. Certainly, you have the earmarks, as they say, of weapons headed for Ukraine falling off the truck, so to speak. And we also know that to that point, that the U.S. military-industrial complex has intentionality when it comes to the promiscuous spreading of weapons. because if there is a promiscuous spreading of weapons, that means that stocks have to be filled and more weapons have to be bought, which means more money added to the bottom line of the military-industrial complex. So your point is well taken. With regard to the comment of Congressman Smith, I do think we need more penetrating analysis, deeper thinking on that, what you call stereotypical divergence between Democrats and Republicans. When that deeper thinking is consummated, we may come to the conclusion that the Democrats feel that they are not trustworthy stewards of U.S. imperialism because they include in their coalition many groups that have been the victims of U.S. settler colonialism, and imperialism, speaking of the Black community, speaking of a good deal of the Mexican-American community, speaking of the community of Asian Americans as well. And so as a result, they have to feel that they have to bend over backwards to show that they are worthy stewards of imperialism, which then leads not only to this escapade in Ukraine, which has potentially catastrophic impact, but recall as well the conflict in Vietnam, which at its height was presided over by one Democratic Party leader, speaking of the Texan Lyndon Baines Johnson. So certainly I think that what this calls for, among other things, is an agonizing reappraisal of the foreign policy of U.S. imperialism. And when we do that agonizing reappraisal, I'm certain we'll come to the conclusion that if the Black community in the first place wants to save itself, it's going to have to end its muteness with regard to a critique of U.S. imperialism and U.S. foreign policy to that end.
Speaking of an area of the world, the Horn of Africa, an area of the world where U.S. imperialism is attempting to peak, more than half of Tigrayan rebel fighters have withdrawn from the front lines in Ethiopia. Their top commander says a month after a ceasefire was agreed to end the 2-year conflict in the northern region of Tigray. This is in Al Jazeera. Your thoughts of the current state of affairs in the Ethiopian conflict?
Well, I trust that the agreement that was reached in South Africa some weeks ago, presided over by former Kenyan President Kenyatta and former Nigerian President Obasanjo, is being adhered to. But there have been intervening circumstances that give me pause. What I'm referring to is the fact that of late, Washington is coming to realize that its relationship with Saudi Arabia, just across the Red Sea from Ethiopia, is not ideal. It's not only that Saudi Arabia is cooperating with Russia and OPEC Plus, and not playing ball with regard to energy prices and the supply of energy, which Mr. Biden and the Democrats see as aimed at them, but it's also the talk that Saudi Arabia may want to enter the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, that Saudi Arabia may turn away from using the dollar as the currency for buying barrels of petroleum. The Saudi Arabia soon may be entertaining a visit by President Xi Jinping of China, which could be a real game changer. And as a result of this increasing negativity towards Saudi Arabia, that heightens Washington's attention towards the Horn of Africa, Ethiopia, in the first place. And to that end, note that in a few days in Washington, there will be a major summit of African leaders and Washington and Mr. Biden and his cohorts. And I would hope and I would trust something that I'm sure will happen, which is that you and your comrades will pay close attention to this meeting. But also, I would hope and I would trust that at least on the sidelines of that meeting, which is this rarity where heads of state and government from Africa are all gathered under one roof, that there will be consultation, enhanced consultations with the Ethiopians, with the Eritreans, who, of course, were not officially at the table in South Africa, probably won't be invited officially to this summit in Washington because of the poor relations between Eritrea and the United States of America. But I would hope that there would be enhanced diplomacy at this Pan-African gathering in Washington, because this conflict in the Horn of Africa between the Tigrayans and the Addis regime is a bleeding sore. It's not helpful or conducive to stability, not only in Africa, but in the Ethiopia and the Horn of Africa as well.
Consortium News has a piece, Mali's break with France shows cracks in Atlantic alliance. When you look at what's happening in Mali and you look at what just hopefully has come to an end in Ethiopia, what are your thoughts on this issue with Mali?
Well, certainly the relations between Bamako and France, the neo-colonial vampire of West Africa, are not ideal. Recall that Bamako requested, in fact demanded, that France withdraw its forces from its territory. This did not go down well in Paris because France's pretensions to being a great power basically rest upon its exploitation of nations like Mali and Senegal and Chad, etc. So I think that what's happening in Africa is a rather painful transition, painful for the North Atlantic countries in the first instance, where you see African nations straining to wrench themselves away from the neo-colonial domination of the North Atlantic powers, headed by Washington and Paris and London, and seeking to establish more fruitful relations with the BRICS, with Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. And in that regard, note that the returning to power of Lula da Silva as president of Brazil will probably be a boon to that latter trend that I just enunciated, because during his first tenure as leader of Brazil, you had an exponential rise in the number of legations and missions and embassies opened by Brazil in Africa. That will be increased and enhanced, I'm sure, during the second tenure of Mr. Da Silva. And at the same time, it weakens the power of the North Atlantic powers, particularly since they plan to enhance their exploitation of African natural resources, particularly as petroleum, in light of their boycott or supposed boycott of Russian petroleum, and that holds true for other natural resources as well. So I think that article from Consortium News is an article that is well worth consulting.
Thank you, Dr. Gerald Horne. You're listening